Some people disappear quietly, not in a dramatic way, not with a big announcement, just slowly, one conversation at a time. A message goes unanswered, a call gets ignored, an invitation gets postponed, and then forgotten. And eventually people start saying things like, they changed, or sometimes something harsher. They think they're better than everyone now, but if you've ever done this yourself, you probably know that explanation doesn't feel quite right. Because the strange thing about cutting people off is that it rarely feels powerful. It often feels confusing. Part of you knows the distance is intentional, but another part of you isn't even sure when it started. Maybe it happened gradually. You stopped replying as quickly. You stopped initiating conversations. You began feeling strangely exhausted after interactions that once felt normal. And at some point you noticed something else. Silence started to feel safer. This is where the misunderstanding begins. From the outside, people often interpret this behavior as arrogance, coldness, or bitterness. They assume someone who distances themselves from others must be angry or antisocial. But psychology suggests something much more complex is usually happening beneath the surface. Because people who quietly cut others off are rarely trying to punish anyone. More often, they are trying to protect something inside themselves. Sometimes it's their energy. Sometimes it's their sense of emotional safety. And sometimes it's a nervous system that has learned, over time, that closeness can be exhausting. Human beings are deeply social creatures. Our brains are wired to connect, cooperate, and belong. But they are also wired for something else. Self-preservation. When interactions repeatedly create stress, confusion, or emotional overload, the brain begins to look for ways to reduce exposure to that discomfort. And one of the simplest strategies it learns is distance. Not confrontation, not explanation, just quiet distance. For some people, this process begins early. Maybe they grew up in environments where emotional boundaries weren't respected, where saying no created conflict, where expressing discomfort led to guilt or criticism. Over time, the brain learns something subtle but powerful. Direct confrontation feels dangerous, so the safer option becomes withdrawal. Not because the person lacks communication skills, but because their nervous system associates honesty with emotional risk. And distance becomes a quieter form of self-protection. You can often see this pattern in small, everyday behaviors. For example, some people will read a message and then leave it there for hours, not because they don't care, but because they feel an immediate pressure to respond in the right way, and their brain stalls. Others might start avoiding group conversations they used to enjoy. They scroll past invitations in their notifications, telling themselves they'll respond later. But later never quite arrives. Sometimes they even open a chat window, type a reply, and then erase it before sending. Not because the message was wrong, but because interacting suddenly feels heavier than it used to. These moments seem small, but they reveal something important about how the brain processes social energy. For some people, interaction is naturally stimulating. For others, especially those who have experienced emotional overwhelm in relationships, interaction can feel like something that drains internal resources, and the brain begins quietly optimizing for recovery. If you've ever noticed yourself doing this, you're definitely not alone. And if you enjoy exploring these quiet patterns of human psychology, subscribing to the channel helps more people discover these insights. One of the more surprising things psychologists have noticed is that people who cut others off often aren't trying to isolate themselves. They're trying to simplify their emotional environment. Because every relationship carries a certain psychological cost, expectations, unspoken tensions, emotional labor. For someone whose nervous system is already managing stress, even small relational demands can start to feel overwhelming. So the brain starts quietly reducing variables. Fewer conversations, fewer explanations, fewer emotional negotiations, and at first, the relief can feel immediate. There is more quiet, more control, more room to breathe. But there's also an interesting paradox hidden inside this behavior. The same people who distance themselves from others often care deeply about relationships, sometimes more deeply than the people around them realize. That's why cutting someone off rarely feels simple. It usually comes with long periods of internal debate. They replay conversations in their head. They question whether they misunderstood something. They wonder if they're being unfair. And yet, the distance still grows, because another part of their mind remembers something important, how drained they felt before. Another mirror moment appears here. Some people will watch their phone light up with a familiar name and feel a brief wave of tension before answering, not because they dislike the person, but because they already sense the emotional effort the conversation might require. Or they'll delay meeting certain people for weeks, even though they genuinely like them. Not because the relationship is bad, but because their internal battery feels low. This is one reason the phrase cutting people off can sometimes be misleading. It makes the behavior sound aggressive, when in reality, it often looks more like slow retreat, a gradual narrowing of the social world. Less drama, less noise, less unpredictability, and the brain starts associating this smaller circle with stability. But there is another hidden layer to this pattern. Distance doesn't just protect energy, it also protects identity. When people spend years adapting to others' expectations, they can lose track of their own emotional boundaries. They say yes when they mean no. They stay in conversations that feel uncomfortable. They tolerate dynamics that quietly exhaust them. So when they finally begin pulling away, something unusual happens. They start noticing themselves again, their preferences, their limits, their emotional signals. And this rediscovery can feel both freeing and unsettling, because it forces a deeper question: which relationships were truly supportive, and which ones only felt normal because they were familiar? That realization can change how someone interacts with the world, not in a dramatic way, but in subtle, quiet adjustments. They respond less often. They explain less. They stop forcing connections that feel heavy. From the outside, it may look like they suddenly became distant, but internally, they may simply be listening to themselves for the first time in years. And here's the final insight many people overlook. People who distance themselves from others are not necessarily rejecting connection. In many cases, they are searching for a version of connection that feels calmer, safer, and more honest. They aren't trying to remove people from their lives. They're trying to remove the pressure to constantly perform inside relationships. And once that pressure disappears, something interesting often happens. The connections that remain tend to become quieter, but stronger, less frequent, but more genuine, because they are built on choice instead of obligation. So if you've ever found yourself slowly pulling away from people and wondering what it means, it may not be a sign that something is wrong with you. It may simply be your mind adjusting its boundaries, trying to create an environment where connection feels sustainable instead of exhausting. Human behavior is full of quiet patterns like this. And sometimes the things we label as distance are really just the mind searching for balance. If this reflection felt familiar, there may be other parts of human psychology quietly shaping the way you move through the world.